Facts don't care about your feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. These are facts.
So I have two news stories to start with, and they're related. I believe they came from the same woman at the same World Economic Forum conference. She's the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. But so let's start with the first one. NPR headline. With food prices climbing, the UN is warning of crippling global shortages. Now let's read what she has to say about this. Kristalina Georgieva, the International Monetary Fund Managing Director, told the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland on Monday that, quote, the anxiety about access to food at a reasonable price globally is hitting the roof, end quote, as food prices continue to go up. That's how they put it. And this says, quote, the UN estimates that in the past year, global food prices have risen by almost 1/3, fertilizer by more than half, and oil prices by almost 2/3. And then later on, in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, the number of people facing extreme hunger has more than doubled since last year, from roughly 10 million to more than 23 million today. Across the three countries, the reports notes, one person is likely dying every 48 seconds from acute hunger-related causes stemming from armed conflict, COVID, climate change, and inflationary pressures worsened by the war in Ukraine. Now, one thing I do respect about this, obviously there's a lot of issues with NPR, but they really kind of... Some of these articles about this and about the rising food costs attribute all of it to the Russia war in Ukraine, and that's not the case at all. I mean, that is definitely a factor, of course, but it seems like a lot of news outlets have been using this story to further kind of instigate and agitate the situation in Russia and Ukraine by trying to put all the blame on that situation, which really just kind of heightens the tension, which is really not what we should be trying to do. But anyway. Continuing on, quote, in India, a devastating heat wave has upset the nation's wheat harvest, driving up prices around the world for the staple commodity. Earlier this month, as temperatures in the capital of Delhi hovered near 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the government announced a ban on wheat exports. Now, this is the part that was just like really made me be like, oh crap, these shortages could be a real freaking problem, because, you know, I don't know how much wheat comes from India, but I know a lot of it does for the world. And in fact, let me look it up before I continue. So yeah, India is the second most wheat producing country in the world, behind, as you would probably guess, China. India produces over half the wheat that the United States does. So the fact that they're not able to export any of that, well, for one, that's for 2020. They produce 107.6 million metric tons of wheat. Who knows what it'll be this year, but it doesn't sound that good. And I don't even know what it was in 2021. But this article, anyway, they go on to highlight the rising inflation, protests, economic emergency that's been in Sri Lanka. I talked about this a few episodes ago. There was also, they talk about the famine in Afghanistan and the economic crisis in Lebanon. They quote the data from the U.S. Labor Department that consumer prices were up 8.3% in April from a year earlier. Food costs were up 9.4%. Meat, poultry, fish, and eggs are up 14.3%. And I can just talk from very subjective experience. My regular job, my day job, is in like social services, and one of the things I do sometimes is I drive. I don't. They're not my clients, but I drive people's clients. I help people who do have clients, and I'll help them by driving the client to a food bank because the food bank gives away vouchers for IDs and also food. And one thing I have noticed recently going to the food bank is when I first started going there, the clients seemed homeless. And now when I go there, I notice more like pretty non-homeless seeming people. And you can't always know that, but they're dressed in clean clothes and arrive by a car, and they seem to have a job, but you can never judge a book by its cover. But it just seems like there's more quote unquote regular participant members of society going to food banks from my kind of limited subjective experience.
Great American food.
In the other article, this is from Reuters, and it's also addressing like similar statements from the same IMF representative or whatever she is, and she basically says that she's worried that the united globalized world neoliberal economic system that basically consumes the whole world, like the undercurrent of what she says in this article is basically saying that neoliberal order is threatened, and I don't want it to be threatened. I mean, of course she doesn't. She works for the IMF, but so here's from the first paragraph of this article. Quote, International Monetary Fund Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva on Wednesday said she worries less about the risk that the war in Ukraine and a further slowdown in China might trigger a global recession than she does about the strength of the trend toward economic and political fragmentation. So, in other words, what this is saying is that she's not worried about like productive slowdowns in China. She's not worried that the war in Ukraine, she doesn't think these things are going to trigger a global recession, but she thinks that the economy is fragmenting, which is a bigger concern for her in the IMF.
It's all about the money. It's all about the dum-dum-da-da-dum-dum. I don't think it's funny.
So the article goes in to talk about how the IMF, their predictions for the global economic outlook, they've reduced it twice because they're like, oh, we're not going to reach that. And then they're like, oh, we're not going to reach that again. But her specific remarks, they close the article with it, and I just find the way she puts it to be really strange, very personal, and I'll just read what she says. So it says, quote, the trend of fragmentation is strong, end quote, Georgieva said during a session titled An Economic Iron Curtain, Scenarios and Their Implications. That continues quoting her, quote, I was raised on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I hated it. And I can tell you it scares me that we maybe were sleepwalking after the hot war into another cold war. So she's basically saying like, Well, this war against Ukraine, that doesn't worry me. What worries me is that we're accidentally going to end up in a Cold War after it. And I mean, that is clearly where we're moving, because as the status quo has been since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has been the sole global superpower. And the US as a nation state's uniqueness as a superpower is clearly waning. China really, their economic prospects, the flourishing of their country, all of that is truly, generally, like, there's so much more potential in it than the US. They don't have the same political leverage that the US does yet, but they're kind of getting there, and with different countries that are also more newly developing. And because of that, people don't feel as strong-armed to participate in the globalized neoliberal economy as they had to feel when the US was really the sole superpower.
Everything blows up in your face.